2, 1.
Thank you. Good morning, my fellow citizens, neighbors, friends, all. My name is Virgil Wood, and we're happy to welcome you back to this Martin Luther King Jubilee Summit. Today, we are privileged to share with us Dr. James Jones of Virginia Tech, who will be sharing with us the Cornerstone Project. Good morning, Dr. James Jones. Welcome.
Good morning, Dr. Wood. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be a part of the celebration of Dr. King's legacy. And hopefully I can show a proposal of how architecture might participate in the Beloved Community Initiative.
Excellent.
So okay, so what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit of background before I go into the Beloved Community Project, since my background gives you a little bit of context of where I'm coming from. I'm originally from a small town in the center of Michigan. It's always good as a Michigander that you've got a map always with you. So I'm right in the center of the state. Small town, typical Midwest town of about 10,000 people. And I think Midwesterners are kind of known for their work ethic, and I kind of pride myself in that as well. Small town, met my wife in high school in that town, and we married a few years later, and I'm proud to say we're coming up on our 40th wedding anniversary.
Wow.
And so quite proud of that, and another influence of my Midwestern background. After leaving high school, I went to the University of Michigan, received my bachelor's, my master's, and also my PhD from the University of Michigan. Left U of M in about 1993, went down to Greensboro, North Carolina, taught at North Carolina A&T State University there, which is an HBCU, for 4 years in the architectural engineering program, and then got an opportunity to join the faculty at Virginia Tech in 1993, joined the architecture program here, and have been at Virginia Tech for the last 20 years. Direct the PhD program for design research, as well as the Center for High Performance Learning Environments, which was really the organization that was the catalyst for the Cornerstone Project that I'm going to describe to you in just a minute. So with that little bit of background and introduction, what I'd like to do is switch over and do a screen share and take you through a presentation of my thoughts on the Cornerstone Project. So as I mentioned, after leaving U of M, we went down to North Carolina in the Greensboro area. And during the time we were there, Greensboro was experiencing a significant population growth. And as a result of that, my daughter, who was in elementary school at the time, was put into a modular classroom. And these modular classrooms often serve in areas that are experiencing high population growth, so the schools are overpopulated. And so this becomes the solution for that population growth. It's also rather typical for financially stressed school systems, such as rural or inner city, where that rather than site-built and the cost of a site-built solution, you'll look at a modular kind of option similar to what I'm showing here. I could not have imagined a more depressing learning environment for my daughter. This is a typical interior of a modular unit, often a single window that you see here. The HVAC system is typically located in the space, generating background noise that makes it difficult for children to hear the teacher or hear the lesson for the day. And even the walls and the roof are fairly thin, typically for a large amount of heat flow, which maximizes the heating and cooling bills for the space, and also transmits noise from mowers and weed eaters and those sorts of things outside. So in terms of a quality space for learning, I could not have imagined my daughter being in a poorer space in order for her to learn. And so this was the beginning of me beginning to think about what a classroom should be in order to address perhaps a more high performance learning scenario. And so that was really the beginning of the Cornerstone project. And the Cornerstone project is sort of a reimagining of what a classroom could be. So taking what I just showed you and perhaps adapting that to something of a jewel of a classroom, similar to what I'm showing here, where perhaps we begin to look at quality of materials and the colors that might be used in the space, as well as the quality of the light. And we merge those together towards an idea of a classroom being a jewel rather than the kind of space I just described. So the thought of a jewel of a classroom is one where teachers actually sign up for, or maybe there's even a waiting list for these types of spaces, where rather than the teacher saying, oh no, I'm in the modular unit, they actually say, oh, fantastic, I get the modular unit, and it's because of the quality of the space that space supports. So the Cornerstone Classroom is really that. It's really reimagining what the classroom wants to be, to take the existing situation and then looking at realistic design options while also considering the budget, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation, towards the idea of a jewel of a classroom that better supports learning. So to begin that, we have to begin to ask the question, what is the classroom of the future and what does it look like? And so sort of building on Margaret Ford Fisher's presentation of a few days ago, we realized that the classroom of the future is not the same as the classroom today. So as a result, we begin to look at strategies such as perhaps the inverted classroom, where the content of the class is perhaps organized into educational videos, and those videos are viewed either at home or perhaps on the road. And then when the students come to class, they're better prepared to either absorb the lecture information or perhaps more importantly, to participate in more hands-on projects in kind of a more constructivist kind of educational model. And we think that this really is perhaps a little bit more in line with the job market today, where the kind of approach to teaching and learning is really more of a mirror of what we see in society, rather than kind of the typical learning module where the teacher presents a lecture and then the students are expected to regurgitate it in some kind of standard of learning test. That is not at all what we envision the classroom of the future being. So along these same lines, we think the classroom of the future is also a collaborative spaces. So rather than a single classroom, it supports multiple ways of interacting, from the individual student to small groups to larger groups, all interacting. And so there's an idea of these collaborative spaces that you'll see here in a few slides that become part of the idea. The other big part of this, of course, is connectivity, either to the internet or to the cloud, but also within the classroom. So also similar to kind of a corporate model, students can work in teams and then share that information very quickly, either amongst themselves within the team, or to be able to project it and share it within the whole class and do this rather seamlessly. This is another big part of this. I alluded to a little bit of the idea of the construction, and part of this is going to be, we think, a combination of modular as well as site-built construction. I'll talk a little bit more of that in a few slides. But the idea here is, you see in this particular diagram, the three classroom areas would be the modular construction. But what is different with what we're proposing is that we look at the spaces in between the classrooms. And so they become part of this zoning or this collaborative space idea, where we have project areas that might be shared between classrooms, workshops, as well as fabrication spaces that might include 3D printers and that sort of thing, that also become shared between the different classrooms. And then, of course, the large meeting and discussion areas that might also be shared as an open assembly space. So it's a very different model than perhaps the typical school or the typical classroom that you would see. The other aspect of this is, because they are modular in combination with site-built, we get an opportunity to look at classroom clustering. So we can group 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 units together depending on the budget or depending on maybe site constraints. So it gives us a great deal of flexibility in order to adapt to contextual conditions that may, as I said, be either budget or site conditions. The other thing too is that you'll notice in this slide is that we're trying to sort of eliminate the double loaded corridor, sort of the typical classroom where the corridor basically is nothing but circulation. In this case, parts of the corridor become the common areas and become shared amongst the classroom. So it really is kind of an architectural challenge to the typical arrangement of classrooms in a school setting. Another aspect that you saw in the previous slide really relates to this. What you see here are two fairly typical modular units. They're often placed on site with a little bit of gap in between, as you can see. And then the spaces in between really become used for a little more than just circulation, where you might see something like a site-built ramp or site-built set of stairs that allow you to access the entry points. And maybe if you're lucky, as you can see here, you might have some kind of roof over as a canopy, so when you step out during the rain, at least you're not getting wet. Our idea is to take advantage of these spaces in between and actually start to use them in the ways that I just described. So you combine that idea of using the spaces in between with a zoning strategy for the classroom. And again, this relates to kind of collaborative areas. We have collaboration spaces. You may have a project workspace space. You have instructional areas as well as fabrication labs. All of these start to become much more seamless than what we see in a typical classroom. And at the same time, you get a certain level of porosity between the spaces, where these in-between spaces I mentioned before actually become connectors so that we can flow maybe freely between classrooms as well as between classroom and these common collaborative space areas that I've mentioned. The other big aspect, of course, of the classroom of the future is that it needs to support a high level of equipment integration. And so one of the workforce development areas that we've been working with is cybersecurity. And as you can imagine, cybersecurity has a great deal of computer needs as well as infrastructure. And so this becomes part of the concern when you start to think about what the classroom of the future wants to be. So it's not only spatial considerations, it's also sort of the technology where you might have 3D printing, laser cutters, as well as the kind of projection that I mentioned before, where students can quickly share their ideas and get feedback on this. And by the way, I should mention that, you know, I teach in the College of Architecture, and this is more or less our model for how we teach our students. It's very collaborative and very project-based, and students share their ideas in open conversations very easily and very, very open. So it's kind of adapting or borrowing from my own experience in teaching in architecture. Another big aspect that we think of this classroom is daylighting. There's been a number of studies that suggest that students perform better in daylit classroom. There was the Heschong study out of California that showed that students performed about 20 points higher on standardized tests when they were taught in classrooms with daylight. But there's a bit of a problem from an architectural perspective with trying to daylight these spaces, in that the wall space is typically dedicated to storage or the kinds of equipment that I mentioned before, or for projections such as whiteboards and projection boards and so forth. So that becomes a little bit difficult when you start to think about introducing what we would think of as a window into a space like that. So our proposition, as you can see here, is what we call the free corner. So we open up the corners, let the light in the corners so it doesn't take up the wall space, but you still get the visual connection to the outside. And in addition, if you see over here, by freeing the corner, you get two directional lights. You might get morning light here, evening or afternoon light here. So there's a temporal response or an awareness of the passing of time that's also an important part of a connection between inside and outside that the classroom needs to also include. And this might also be skylights or clear stories. In this case, you see the two classrooms here. This might be the shared space, the site-built space, where we might introduce some kind of translucent roof or a skylight that brings light into that shared space, but then also the classrooms might borrow that daylight by a porous boundary, which I'll talk more about in just a second. So the light really sort of permeates the entire space and gives life to the space. I mentioned that our strategy is one of modular construction, and currently we're sort of thinking of two modular units, one that might be larger, as you see here, and then a smaller that might be a more typical classroom unit. And the benefits of the modular construction are, first of all, that you get quality control in terms of the product. And then the other thing, of course, is the relatively fast construction time. So you can be up and running typically faster than site built. And then the other thing that's often suggested is lower cost. But frankly, our experience has been the cost of the modular construction, if you're going to do quality modular construction, is maybe only marginally less than site built. But you do get the benefits, as I mentioned, of the quality as well as the time of construction. Our approach is to combine the modular units with the site built. And by that, I mean some parts of this will actually be built by a contractor on site. These will be the infill spaces I mentioned before. And then the modular units sort of define the boundaries to the overall site condition. And by going this route, we think we get a great deal of flexibility in how we arrange these different conditions and how we might cluster them. Here you can see a simple 2-classroom cluster. Here we have 4, and then so forth. So it gives us a great deal of flexibility to adapt to both budget constraints that the school system might have, as well as to the site constraints, which I'll show you here in just a second. So here is addressing the site constraints, where you might have different configurations of existing buildings. So the darker boxes you see here might be an existing school, perhaps an elementary or a high school, and that we can use this modular approach, arrange the modules in different ways to kind of adapt to that particular site condition. So it gives us a great deal of flexibility for that. As an example of that, we've been working with Wythe County Schools here in Virginia over the past couple of years on this very idea. They, similar to many rural school districts, have a need to expand, but a fairly limited budget to do that. So we worked with them, and using this modular idea, we came up with 3 different schemes that you see here, called the wing, the ribbon, and the campus. All of these are based on the strategy that I'm describing here, sort of modular clustering. So here's a schematic drawing for the Wythe County School. And so we've color-coded the different clusters. So these might be within subjects or within disciplines, or they may cut across disciplinary boundaries to sort of share knowledge within the cluster. And the same idea I mentioned before, sort of a flow of space, but it's no longer the double-loaded corridor. You have these common areas that sort of break the space up, and they also become usable in terms of this shared condition with the modular units. Here you see the concept of the in-between spaces. So the areas we're showing here would be site built by a contractor, and then the areas here would be modular. So the combination of that, we think, gives us advantages of both and some variety in terms of the quality of the space that you get. What I'm showing here, particularly on the right side of the image, is how the site-built condition actually gives us a little bit of an architectural variation. So those site-built areas can use space frame or maybe truss construction. They can be flat roof or they can be pitched roof. And the idea here is it gives you some opportunity for the building to sort of speak to the local architectural character. And so it sort of merges with the community and the character of the community and doesn't become something that's completely alien or foreign to that. In addition to that, it presents opportunities to take some of these spaces that would be in between and use them as outdoor spaces. So here you see sort of a pergola kind of strategy where this might be a shading element, and it might provide some shade or some rain protection as an entry condition. It might be also be an outdoor space where you could sit, have conversations, maybe even have an outdoor classroom that would sit underneath this pergola. So we think there's a great deal of flexibility, both in terms of interior as well as the interior-exterior dialogue that this strategy supports. Another aspect of this that we're proposing is a fairly high degree of porosity between the units, particularly between the classroom and the common spaces. So what that means is, what we're thinking is the classrooms might have a wall that actually is transformable. So it might be something like a garage door wall. And that door could be down for privacy and security, or it could also be up and open the space up to these common areas. So you get a high degree of porosity between the spaces, and it supports that kind of free flow zoning that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. The site-built language is a bit different than the modular language. So you're probably talking a column and beam or truss kind of construction. And for me as the architect, I get sort of excited because there then becomes architectural opportunities to kind of tell stories through the architecture about the differences in the way that we build and the way that we make. And so this is kind of just another layer of an idea about how the building might teach in one way or another that goes beyond the formal teaching of the classroom. And again, the porosity, so here you see the spaces with the doors down, and then here and here you see the spaces with the doors up. And so you get a great deal of flexibility. I was out in Portland about 10 years ago at a conference for schools of the future, and they took us to an alternative school that was just outside of Portland. And they had a strategy very similar to this. And it was really amazing how the teachers liked it and even the students liked it, and how much they used it to open and close the classroom space up to the common areas for conversation, joint presentations. And so it's, we think it's an idea that maybe has found its day. And as I mentioned before, sort of the breaking down of the typical double-loaded corridor. So now we get a different kind of flow to the space, both between spaces as well as through the entire space. And so I mentioned that I've been working with Wythe County Schools. And so among the people we've worked with is your school superintendent, Dr. Perry at Wythe County. And he gave me a quote in one of our meetings that I thought was rather profound and also quite disturbing. And that quote you see here is, with our current budget model, our schools are on a 150-year construction cycle. And if you think about that for a minute, it's incredibly disturbing to think that our kids are being taught potentially in a school that's being expected to last 150 years. I can't imagine a school 50 years old supporting the kind of emerging technology questions that are being asked through curriculum, as well as workforce training, much less a school 150 years old. And in fact, this is fairly common in our area for rural districts in Western Virginia. Most of them are not even as good a shape as Wythe County. Their tax base and it just doesn't support them to be able to raise revenues for new schools. And so they're being forced to look at alternatives. And the similar kind of situation exists for our rural as well as urban or inner city schools. The tax base just isn't there to support the kind of construction cycle that we need. So that brings me to the next to last slide, which is then how might we think about doing this? And this is where my interaction with Ralph have come in, where perhaps we begin to rethink the relationship between local as well as state or federal government, the relationship between the school district and industry partners toward perhaps a different model for how we support this. So in this particular case, which, sorry, is one of my kind of hand sketches here, in the middle, you see the idea of the classroom that I just described. And we begin to think of it as an incubator. So in a sense, those incubators become the classrooms that support workforce training and development through maybe high schools, trade schools, or community college partnerships. And what we get as a result of that, if we focus on workforce training, the output of this is a highly qualified workforce that then serves our industrial partners. This might be cybersecurity, healthcare, it might be technology for industry, and we could keep going with the list of potential partners here. But the idea is the output is kind of knowledge capital that serves the industrial partner. So they get very high quality workers that come out of the program. In return, we think that the industrial partners provide something back to the loop in terms of support. That support might be in terms of direct support for the infrastructure development. It might and probably should be assistance in developing the curriculum that helps to train those workers to best serve the industrial partner. And perhaps it's capital investment that helps to feed not only to the state and local government, but perhaps, what happened? Oops, sorry for that. That serves directly, I can't touch it. That serves directly as input to the workforce training. And so our thoughts on the capital investment might go something like this, where that perhaps as some of the profit from the industrial partner, they feed that into this investment in infrastructure development. Or it might also be that some portion of the payment to the new workers actually funnels back to this investment strategy over maybe 5 years or something like that. So the benefit from the workers perhaps is they get a low cost, high quality education that feeds the workforce, and in return for that, perhaps some small portion of their pay feeds back into this as well. So it's both the industrial partner and perhaps the workers that somehow feed into this. And by the way, we currently have a small grant proposal in place that we're hoping to get so that we can look at how this might work in a little bit more detail over the coming months. Last thing I want to say here is that you can see from this arrow that the idea with the incubator process is that we begin to look perhaps at having multiple communities participate. So we may have both rural and urban. Project A might be for cybersecurity. Project B might be for nursing and healthcare training. Project C might be more focused on industrial automation and so forth. And so from that, we have these incubators that serve a region. And so that might be Virginia, for example, where we're thinking of perhaps of combining Richmond with the Wythe County idea and serve Richmond as a region for multiple workforce incubators that feed into this model. So with that, just kind of in summary, the whole idea behind Cornerstone, as you can see here, is to take the existing situation that my daughter was exposed to and challenge that and begin to look at, can we let architecture participate in sort of a restructuring and a revitalization of community, and looking at these modular units being jewels of a classroom as opposed to the kind of typical units, which, as I said, could not be more oppressive as a learning environment. So that's my thoughts on the Cornerstone project, and I'll open it up for questions or comments from there.
That's great. Virgil.
Yes, this is absolutely extraordinary. I want to ask you a question, not on the subject, just for a quick minute. I'm delighted to see you've been through A&T Greensboro. Mm-hmm. Did you ever, maybe you were too late to have met Samuel DeWitt Proctor. He was an early president there for a short time. Worked closely with Lyndon Johnson for the Great Society legislation, et cetera.
Oh, wow.
Did you ever encounter that name?
I encountered the name, but I did not meet him. No.
Yeah, no. I think he was probably was pretty much out of circulation when you came along.
I will say though, I'm rather proud of this. My office was in McNair Hall.
Yes.
I don't know if you know Ron McNair.
Yes, indeed. So I knew Ron when he was at MIT.
He he was the first African American to go into space, I believe.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I actually worked in the building that was named after him. So that was a fantastic opportunity.
Right. Well, I have one or two questions, but let me defer until some others have an opportunity.
Dr. Wood, this is Amanda, and it looks like Siobhan is in our attendee room and would like to ask a question, so I'm going to give her the microphone now.
Excellent. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good morning. Okay, perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your presentation. And I just wanted to say, going to actually being an undergrad in Virginia Tech, the classrooms, I mean, you appreciate being able to go to Virginia Tech, first of all, but the engineering classrooms always made us feel, or made me feel, very closed in and exhausted. Almost as if I were stuck. So I appreciate the idea. This was more of a comment. I appreciate the idea of the open space for when these kids come into these students come into these classrooms, and you can almost see that you're leaving them, to kind of open them up to a different environment. And I love the idea of letting the sun in as well. So I enjoyed this presentation all the way around, because I can remember being in calculus and just wanting to kind of jump out of the window or run out the door, because the classroom spaces just reminded me, number one, of being in high school, and number two, that there really was not a lot of space at all. So being a person that is in need of open space, I appreciate your plan.
Thank you for that. And I totally agree with you. I don't know if you've had a chance to come into Kogel Hall, which is where most of the architecture program is located, but it's really an amazing space because there's almost no doors separating any of the classrooms. In fact, you're hard pressed to find something that looks like a classroom. We have spaces for pinning up and having discussions, but really very few spaces that you would kind of traditionally define as a classroom. And I know the university has had several conversations over the past few years that look at our model in architecture and how we teach, and they're trying to develop approaches to sort of bring that to other disciplines such as engineering. But there's a lot of inertia involved with trying to make those kinds of changes. I'll just leave it at that.
And I just one more thing, just something that you said with the open spaces. I think with engineering, it's almost, it creates the mindset that, you know, you're pretty much on your own. You have to fight through these things on your own. You have to figure these concepts out on your own. You have to be brave enough to go to your professor or another professor if you don't understand. And I think these open spaces, as you mentioned before, in some way create community and create a village. So now there are no walls in between you guys working together and helping each other. Those doors are always open. So again, thank you.
You're absolutely right. And you're touching on something that really perhaps is at the core of what we're talking about. And that is, you know, I taught in an architectural engineering program, as I mentioned, for 4 years. And that program, I think, is rather representative of many engineering programs where the approach is one of you basically lecture, you present the material, and then you're expected as the student to solve problems either in homework and then also solve problems on an exam. And so it's a fairly individual learning model in the sense that you're kind of expected to solve the problem on your own. In architecture, it's completely different. In architecture, the students are encouraged to work collaboratively. So you're sitting next to someone and it's encouraged that you ask them, well, what do you think about this design? Or what do you think about this proposal? Or what do you think about this roof detail? Or whatever it might be. And in fact, we then scale that up where we pin the work up, and it's a similar kind of conversation between students and faculty. So it really is a very different pedagogical model that we work within. And this is really, I think, the foundation of what we're trying to get at, is perhaps something of what we do needs to find its way into other disciplines that perhaps look at the world a little bit differently.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Brother Ralph, I have a question, but I know you will speak to the issue of, the corresponding concerns in terms of, capitalizing and financing. This is extraordinary. We want to get ahead of the curve here. And I believe we're going to be, Jim, we're going to be looking at similar development somewhere in the Houston area. We've mapped out an area based on our meeting last night. I said to the assembly, put a dot on the space where we are, and then draw a circle, a radius of 50 miles around. And we come into some very interesting potential partners as well as needs that this can meet. Mm-hmm. And I will ask a question, but I want Ralph to go first because I know that he's thought through some of the implications of how we capitalize and finance a model like this.
Thanks, Virgil. I'm actually here with Jim, so I'm going to join the show here at this end.
Great.
We're color coordinated. So I just wanted to say a few comments about like how we came together on these ideas, because I think it's sort of if you think about where we are in the College of Architecture and Urban Studies. I'm in the School of Public and International Affairs, and Jim is in architecture. And the sort of combination here is, just think about it in terms of just architecture, right? So if, I think the realization we both had was you have the sort of physical design architecture, which is, what Jim has spent the majority of his presentation talking about. And then where my interest came in was in the sort of financial architecture, right? I think for a while we viewed architecture in this sort of predominantly this design, the space, the physical space, and then the financing has been, secondary. I think that my challenge to the profession is we have to integrate the financing of the architecture. What is the financial architecture that enables this new sort of physical space to be realized? I think, it's actually an interesting challenge. If you were to challenge all architects, has the wealth been distributed in some way through the design of the architecture you have enabled? That's a really interesting question to ask and think about, because if you're building schools, but the wealth that's created through the construction industry in relation to these projects is not perhaps some way shared and funneled back to the schools, there's no way you can break the 150-year timeline in terms of the financing. So, that's kind of how we came together. And there's also, and there's this sort of interesting notion of design spacing as we're talking about design today. So design space is this sort of cognitive concept where I think about this in terms of sustainability. So if you define a problem purely in an environmental way, you're likely to solve the environmental problem. But in doing so, the evidence suggests you might create occupational health and safety risks, because instead of letting emissions be released into the atmosphere, for example, you could capture them and keep them in the work environment, increasing the risk to the workers and exposure. Right? So what design space does is it says let's expand that a bit. So let's not only think about environment, let's think about the worker health and safety, let's think about other dimensions. And so you're constraining the sort of the cognitive design space, which actually opens up creativity in design, in how you solve that problem. So you're architecting a much more complex sort of set of issues you need to resolve. And so this notion of design space is interesting in the context of today. So one dimension is designing school learning environments that work. And now we can expand that design space to say, and the financing of that is done in such a way that schools have a potential revenue stream coming back from the investments in the schools that have been made in terms of these new classroom spaces. And so, and there may be other aspects of how we can enhance the financing so there is some return to the state, some return to the actual schools so they can reinvest, and you get reinforcing sort of this loop. I think the analogy is, a lot of people in sustainable development think about sort of the closed loop thinking. You extract resources, you use them, but at some point they have to go back into the sort of biological system or the technical industrial system and be recycled. I'm sort of thinking that there's also a loop analogy for this work, in terms of the financing coming back into the schools so they can reinvest. So I think there's an emerging frontier here in terms of, what we're trying to do. We're trying to take really interesting, exciting ideas in terms of physical space, and it could be infrastructure, there could be other legs to this, but then really looking at the financing from this kind of binary economics or inclusive capitalism way. And you've heard different perspectives on that from Norm Kurland in terms of his approach. You've heard from Robert Ashford talking about his ideas. So we already have some really rich work that's been developed in this area. So I think part of the next steps will be sharing these sort of economic ideas with people who are interested in these projects, and then seeing where we can go with this. And I think the nice thing about what Jim has done is put together a really exciting, concrete example that we can really think carefully about in terms of how could the financing of these jewels of classroom space work in a way that gives schools an opportunity to have a revenue income stream from the investments that are made in these school spaces. So I think that's why I'm so excited in this. And it's also interesting when you think about our college, and that we have the School of Public and International Affairs and Architecture. This is one of the first times in my time being here that there's really a fundamental link that we could really build on and develop. So it's exciting times.
Yeah, I agree. And maybe just a couple of additional thoughts to that. Ralph was mentioning, how architecture perhaps is contributing to the inequity, and I agree with that. And so as he was talking, it made me think about what schools are today. And so in the case of Wythe County Schools, for example, they're a financially stressed school system. So rather than even build a new school, they're going to try to modify their existing high school to accommodate the kind of curriculum that we're talking about, which is crazy. It's like forcing us, a square peg into a round hole. But if you think about it, that's fairly common. And even for the school systems that are fortunate enough to build a school, that for those school systems that are financially stressed, they end up being inferior schools compared to the school systems that, let's say, are much wealthier, where the kinds of strategies that I've mentioned you're starting to see in the wealthier school systems. And what I'm suggesting here is that somehow perpetuates the sort of disparity that we see, that the students that are in these financially stressed school systems aren't being given the opportunity through their educational model and through their educational infrastructure to begin to competitively to compete with those students that are in the more wealthy school systems. So this is a way of perhaps being able to address that inequity. It's pretty exciting, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have 2 or 3 questions. I just raised one of them now, and we talk later about other aspects of this. Central to everything I think I'm trying to be about since, I worked with Martin 10 years. I actually joined him in 59 when he was still shaping SCLC. SCLC was 2 years old then, and it did not come into a real shape until Birmingham in 63. That's when SCLC really became a young adult, I'd say, as an organization. But as I look back across all these years and the different experiences I've been able to be a part of, I believe that we often lose sight of what you have kept central here, and I love this. That is, what is the impact of whatever we do on people? And people not as robots. We've treated people as though they were robots all along. I think the robots have grown out of our mindset about that. And here we're now going to say, what's good for people and for learning? And that's the driving premise that I love so much. And I believe that this presents a unique opportunity for some serious public-private venturing. Where the ownership is built into the people who make it happen, so that these are no longer seen as a way that the rich can run in and scoop up an opportunity and cream the future wealth creation of it. So if you think about the wealth creating potential of the future of these operations, and you can bring some of that capital back into the development of the system itself, seems to me we've created a loop that is self-sustaining. But my question is, Jim, have you shared in the charrette process? Are you familiar with that?
Absolutely. In fact, the proposal that I mentioned that we currently have in has built into it charrette as one of the tasks. So we want to bring in two aspects of that. One is we want to identify faculty from perhaps community colleges that are working in these workforce areas that have some experience, and we want to pick their brains, get their input. And so from that, we might take some input from them and then develop some design ideas, and through the charrette process, present it back to them and get their feedback. So that would be one. The other aspect of this that we also see kind of collaborative in a charrette kind of format is the question of the investment. So trying to identify and bring in the industrial partners along with state and local representatives to begin to ask, what might this look like as a financial model in order to support this? And then the same idea that you're getting at, that is to get their input to say, will it work? What are the problems that you see with it that we don't see because perhaps we're not in that space? And so absolutely, the charrette process is one that we see value in.
So talk a good deal about uneconomic economics. In other words, so much of our productive capacity goes into building stuff that is built to destroy, like warfare. And it seems to me that we're going to have to think along the way about what kind of industry, not just industry period, but what kind of industry drives this kind of model. And it may well be that this can contribute to our understanding that we don't need war to cure the economy, as the Second World War did. As we know, the Roosevelt program was not what saved the economy. It was the war economy parallel to that. But somehow we've got to think about, maybe this is where some of the other departments in the university can come in, is if we don't need war to save the economy, then we don't need war anymore. You know, somewhere along the way that discussion can be held. It's not necessarily, this is not necessarily the place. But I want to tell you that my reading is that we do have a region here in the Houston area that would look with great favor on this model. And I would suggest that we would look at it from the perspective of the workforce as a way to sell it initially. Mm-hmm. And we can continue some of those conversations as we go.
I just wanted to respond to one of the remarks you said, Virgil. I think if I look at the existing way we do things to the future way we could do things, there's sort of the existing way is this sort of very indirect perspective on how things work. So you, in the case of designing and building out schools, for example, and enriching schools, you know, the existing model is you would have this investment, you'd have potentially jobs created in the future. The tax revenue would then perhaps increase from these jobs that you've created in the future, which would then enable the schools to have a richer tax base to invest in more development, right? So it's a very indirect, long-term approach. What I think we're proposing here is let's cut that. Let's make it a direct approach where the investment in the schools benefits the schools through the sharing of profits. It's direct. We're cutting out that long cycle that needs to play out, this sort of trickle-down analogy, which we're currently basing a lot of policy and decisions on, which I think is wrong, completely wrong-headed. I think we need to have a much more direct approach to how we finance, services for a society. And if we share in the profits and benefits from that financing, you will have people with a higher effective demand or purchasing power who could spend on those goods and services. And that's kind of the new place I would like to sort of move into with this collaborative project. And I think it will take sort of one or two places in the country that are willing to make a run at this idea to see how could it work. It will require government, sort of state, local government, maybe federal. It will require industrial partners. It will require school districts. It will require academics to all come together to sort of think carefully about this. And we might have different sort of ways to construct this and put these ideas together, which may be very tailored to Houston or Virginia or other regions of the country. But I think we have to try, because what we currently have clearly doesn't work. If we're looking at these investment horizons, which are way beyond anything practical, I think it's time for fundamental change. So that's really, that's what excites me about this is, we have a direct approach,
And maybe if I could add to that and respond to Virgil, your comment about bringing others in. I think you're absolutely right, because I think what underlies that suggestion is perhaps there's a rethinking of the whole educational model that this country works within. And I know this is long-term and it's rather grand as a goal, but really what we're suggesting is re-looking at how we teach our children. And that perhaps the current model of sort of the formal lecture, and then you spit it back out on an exam and you do a few homework problems, is not really preparing our kids, first of all, for the real world, so to speak, but more importantly, in some ways, perhaps it's actually stagnating creativity and creative thought. And so what we're thinking through this is eventually perhaps beginning to dissolve the boundaries between disciplines in the way that we teach. And I think that's what you're getting at with the possibility of bringing others in. And so, there's an economic model, there's a religious model aspect of this. There certainly is engineering, and there's architecture, and there's math, and there's science. And so perhaps we begin to think a little bit outside the box in how this school starts to operate to begin to dissolve those boundaries. Mm-hmm. And this is of course long-term, but I think it should be part of our goal.
If you think about what I found interesting about these ideas of how do you solve some of the biggest problems we're facing. So Jay Forrester up at MIT, the father of system dynamics thinking, really. Goes back to the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth work that he did. He spent his whole career thinking about and advancing system dynamics. And when I had discussions with him when I was a graduate student, he sort of said to me, I've stopped trying to educate graduates now. It's too late. It's way too late. So he went right back to the beginning and was back in young, I'm not sure exactly which level, but he sort of walked away from graduate school and was down in the schools essentially. And so what I love about this project is it's right at the ground floor to a certain extent. This is educating students to just think without boundaries, right? And so at Virginia Tech, we have this Beyond Boundaries initiative. If this project works, the students will come in and just look at us and say, what are you doing here? And so if they sort of fix our learning environment, when this cohort of students, if they go through these classrooms, comes to us, they'll be demanding the experience that they've just grown up with. I mean, we will have to change. So there is some, I mean, there's a nice sort of element to this, and it's interesting. If you look at sort of leading minds of the world, a lot of them at some point go back to the very young student and just let them be creative, because they are creative. And then we build these structures in place which push them into this siloed way of learning. And then that's what they expect over time, but we've created that. So I think we also need to now think about how do we uncreate it.
So maybe if I could add to that, I mentioned that I teach in architecture. And so we're a 5-year program. The first year is called the Foundation Program. And that's where all of our students in the different programs of industrial design, architecture, interior design, all come together in that first year. And the faculty kind of joke, but it's not really a joke, that the first year we actually have to retrain the students how to think, because they come out of a 12-year education where, as Ralph said, they're taught to learn in a certain way, they're taught to think perhaps in a certain way, and we're trying to strip that apart. And one of the fundamental things that we try to teach to them is there's no one right answer. There can be many different right answers, and they're so focused on the answer, and we say there isn't one answer. Particularly in the architecture world, you give 20 architects the same problem, you get 20 different solutions, all of which could be beautiful and perfectly appropriate. So it really is a different way of thinking, and that's perhaps the undertone of what we're talking about here. Uh-oh.
Within the next 100 days, we must on the ground be present. Now, how far is Roanoke in Wythe County?
No, it's the other direction.
How far is Wythe from, what is the closest urban area to Wythe County, or in Wythe County?
Wytheville, which I wouldn't really call an urban area. It's a small town about like my hometown, probably somewhere around 10,000 people.
So the county is is a rural county then?
Very much. Very much, yeah.
I see. How far would that be from Blacksburg, roughly?
It's about 45 minutes.
Okay, so if we looked at Blacksburg, put a pinpoint on Blacksburg and draw a circle 50 miles out, what other areas do we bring in within 50 miles around the radius there?
Roanoke, which is a little more urban, yeah.
I see. How far would you have to stretch to get Lynchburg in there?
Oh, you'd have to stretch about another 60 miles.
Oh, okay. All right. It's too far. Okay. All right. This is fine. Now, here's what I want to say. First of all, I want us to think about this not just in terms of long-term dimension. I think there are short-term energies and dynamics around this that we don't have to think about it as long-term and grand. Mm-hmm. It's going to rescue some things that we don't know how to deal with right now. For example, I look at most schools and it reminds me of prisons.
Yes, I agree.
Or factories. We built these things when people were cogs in a machine process that AI is going to take over now, and they are totally irrelevant to the future that is emerging. Mm-hmm. So I think we will want to bring all of this together within the next 100 days and get an initiative going in that area of Virginia, in the Richmond, Virginia area, and here in the Houston region. Mm-hmm. And we're already, I think we have everything we need now to begin making proposals more broadly. I don't know how many proposals there are out, but Ralph, in terms of what your naming of the partners for this, you started with governments. I wouldn't start with governments. Governments will adopt to what the citizens demand. I'll say 3 things about King, and I want to say something about Virginia Tech specifically, because I am overwhelmed with delight at the commitment that this university has made to this King's dream. I don't think there's any university in America that matches it. I know Stanford has its papers and all of that. Somehow they are They are using King's legacy, not to do what King was doing. I don't want to critique them, but I want to say that what Virginia Tech is bringing to the table matches and supersedes so many others. And I want to celebrate that. And I also want to say that Virginia Union, if it weren't for Virginia Union, I wouldn't be here. And if it were not for Virginia Union, we would not have Corey Walker on board. And its part is going to grow in this. And I think it's a dynamic part. But this is what I want to say. The whole idea of beloved community emerges into the Black world through a man named John Malchus Ellison. He was the first African-American president of Virginia Union University. Although Virginia Union was founded by slaves, its first several presidents were not African-American. He was the first one. He was my president. He had become president in 1940. I came in 1948. And there's an interesting thing that I rejoice in, that at a student reception, the first night I was at the university, he gave me a job that I had for 4 years. I was the bell ringer for the university. Every hour, on the hour, 5 minutes before the hour, I had to ring the bell. It was an interesting way to be a part of the community. And of course, you know, there were bribes all the time. Students said, we'll give you a quarter if you go ring the bell early, you know, things like that. But I like to think about the uniqueness of Virginia Union as well. And I think you would talk about the uniqueness of your experience with A&T. And I just love how it was your daughter's experience that has driven you, has driven your creativity. And how do we do this? Yesterday, Corey Walker talked about his daughter, giving him an insight about what is the nature of the future. And Ralph, I know your beautiful children, and we have that thing going with them. It's about the children. It's about the children. If we get it right for the children, if we get it right for the old folks, we will have sustainability. And if we ignore either one of those, we will not have anything to sustain. And once we get that right, it will be right for everybody in between. I would want to also add that you bring a dimension to this, Jim, that allows us to answer the question, why was King so certain that we would get to the promised line? He was certain about that. And he invested his life and his blood on that proposition. And what you've given us here is sort of the physical, some aspects of the physical side, and the opportunity to deal with the financial and legal infrastructure that will make this happen. It's going to be good for all our children. Right now, we had children in what was thought to be the safest, most up-to-date school setting in Florida. And we know that story. It's a sad story. Somehow, if we can bring community to the learning environment, and I believe that this is a contribution along the way. And on behalf of all of us, Jim, I want to say a big thank you, and we look forward to the next step.
Fantastic. And I thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this.
Excellent.
Very exciting.
We're going to continue ringing that bell, Virgil, collectively from all of our various projects. And I think that's a nice analogy moving forward. Let's ring it loud.
Yes, yes.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.